September 24th, 1916. The Great War rages across Europe. History books record that the Imperial German Zeppelin L-33 was brought down by British anti-aircraft fire over Little Wigborough, Essex. The official report states it was a standard military engagement. But the official report is a lie. What you are about to hear is the contents of a recovered journal, found in the wreckage but omitted from the archives. It belongs to the only man who knew the truth. This is not a story of war. It is a story of what was waiting for them in the dark above the clouds. I remember the cold most of all. It was not the simple chill of a winter night in Hamburg. This was a dead cold, a void that ignored the leather of my flight jacket and the heavy wool of my tunic. At 10,000 feet, the air does not just freeze you, it hates you. We were suspended in the dark, a tiny speck of metal and canvas floating in an ocean of black nothingness. My fingers were stiff inside my gloves, curled around the railing as if holding on could keep the world from tilting. The noise was a physical weight. The Maybach engines did not just roar, they lived inside our skulls. The vibration rattled my teeth and shook the marrow in my bones. For hours, there was no silence, only the mechanical scream that drove the propellers. We had to shout to be heard, mouth to ear, but mostly we did not speak. We just watched the instruments. The cramped gondola smelled of hot oil, stale sweat, and the sour, metallic tang of hydrogen leaking from the gas cells above us. We were riding a floating bomb, and we all knew it. Captain Strasser stood at the front of the control car. He did not shiver. He looked through the slanted glass at the clouds below, his face pale in the green glow of the instrument dials. He was hunting a city. We were the carriers of iron death, waiting to pull the levers that would drop ruin onto the sleeping houses of London. I tried not to think about the people down there. I focused on the rhythm of the motors, the trembling needle of the height gauge, and the ache in my chest. Breathing was hard work. The air was so thin it felt like it had been stretched tight. We clamped the oxygen masks to our faces, gasping like fish pulled from the water. Every breath was a struggle, a reminder that we were trespassing in a place where men were not meant to be. We were isolated, cut off from the earth, hidden by the night and the clouds. I looked out into the darkness, believing we were the masters of the sky. I thought the only things to fear were the British guns and the fire. I was wrong. The clouds broke open beneath us, tearing apart like old cotton. London was not a city of lights that night. It was a bruise on the dark earth, a smudge of deeper black hidden in the heavy river mist. We could see the Thames winding like a gray snake, shining faintly under the moon when the fog shifted. But the British knew we were there. The searchlights were already sweeping the sky, great, pale fingers reaching up from the ground, blindly feeling for our belly. They crossed and parted, slicing through the smoke, hunting for the silver skin of our ship. We saw the flashes of their guns before we heard them. Down in the mud, men were firing steel at the stars. From our height, it looked like a festival. Puffs of gray smoke bloomed in the air below us, silent at first, then followed by the dull, thumping cough of the explosions. They were like silent fireworks, beautiful and deadly. I watched a shell burst 1,000 feet below, a flower of fire that vanished in a second. We were too high for them, or so we told ourselves. We were ghosts floating above their anger. Muller, the navigator, was bent over his maps, sweating despite the freezing wind. He cursed the fog. He needed a bridge, a rail line, something hard and real to aim at. But the city was a ghost, too. Strasser did not wait. He signaled with a sharp chop of his hand. I unlocked the release mechanism. The metal was cold enough to burn my skin. I felt the heavy clunk of the latches opening, a vibration that ran through the floorboards. Then came the lurch. It is a feeling you never forget. The sudden leap of the ship as the iron weight falls away. The Zeppelin groaned and shot upward, freed from its burden. I held my breath and counted the seconds. Down below, in the deep well of the night, small sparks appeared. They looked tiny, like matches struck in a dark cellar. No screams reached us, no crumbling walls, just little flashes of orange fire that flickered and died. We had done our duty. We turned the rudder to head for the sea, believing the night was over. But the true night had not even begun. We had turned the ship north, running from the guns and the searchlights, seeking the safety of the open sea. The adrenaline was fading, leaving us cold and hollow. I was rubbing warmth back into my hands when Hans, the forward lookout, called out. His voice was not urgent, just confused. He pointed upward, through the glass ceiling of the gondola, toward the high dark. At first, I thought it was a planet, Mars or Venus, burning bright in the winter sky. But stars do not sit below the moon, and planets do not hang inside the atmosphere. It was a single point of light, steady and unblinking. It did not flicker like the exhaust of an airplane engine, nor did it burn with the yellow hunger of a flare. It was a pale, sick violet, the color of a bruise on pale skin. It sat just above the cloud layer, perhaps a mile away from us. In 1916, nothing flew that high and stayed still. An airplane must move to stay aloft, or it falls. A balloon drifts with the wind. But this light was anchored in the sky, as if nailed to the firmament itself. Captain Strasser grabbed his binoculars. I saw his jaw tighten, the muscles in his neck standing out like cords. He thought it was a trap. He barked an order to the helmsman, believing it to be some new British devilry, a high-altitude mine or a silent interceptor. We banked hard to the port side, the huge frame of the Zeppelin groaning as we tried to put distance between us and the unknown. The engine screamed as we pushed for more speed, but the light did not chase us, and it did not fall behind. As we turned, I watched it relative to the clouds. The wind up here was blowing a gale, tearing the mist into ribbons, pushing our massive airship sideways. Yet the violet star did not drift an inch. It ignored the wind. It ignored the sky. It simply hung there, defying the storm and the gravity that pulled at the rest of us. That was when the fear started to settle in my gut. Not the fear of death, but the fear of something wrong. It was watching us. We were pushing the engines to their breaking point, the roar so loud it felt like a physical wall around us. Then, in the heartbeat between one breath and the next, the wall vanished. The sound did not sputter. The engines did not cough or choke on fuel. They simply stopped. It was as if a giant hand had reached down and gripped the crankshafts, freezing them in place. I looked out the side window and saw the massive propellers. They did not slow down to a crawl. They stopped mid-spin, their blades biting into the air, frozen in an impossible posture that should have snapped the mounts. The silence that followed was louder than the noise had been. It was a thick, heavy thing that pressed against my eardrums until they throbbed. In a Zeppelin, you are always hearing something. The wind whistling through the wires, the creak of the wooden walkways, the distant hum of the gas. But all of that was gone. Even the wind outside seemed to have died. We were no longer drifting. We were pinned in space. I felt a lightness in my stomach, the kind you feel when a ship crests a wave. But the sensation did not end. I heard Mueller try to shout, but his voice sounded wrong. It was flat and thin, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a deep well or through a thick layer of felt. The words did not travel through the air. They just fell to the floor. Strasser was frantic, his hands flying over the ignition switches, his face a mask of disbelief. He was a man of machines and logic, and the machines had just betrayed the very laws of the world. He kept clicking the metal toggles, but there was not even a spark. I looked at the altimeter on the brass instrument panel. The needle should have been dropping as we lost the lift from our forward motion or rising as the wind took us. Instead, the needle was dead. It was stuck fast at 10,000 feet, as if the air itself had turned to solid stone around us. We were hanging in a vacuum, a tomb of silk and aluminum suspended in the black. No bird, no machine, and no man should ever be that still. Then, the violet light began to grow, and the shadows in the corner of the room started to stretch toward us. The violet glow that had blinded us began to fade, dying down like embers in a wet fire. I wished it had stayed, because what it left behind was worse. As the light retreated, it revealed the shape of the thing sharing the sky with us. It was not a machine. It was a hole in the universe. It was a triangle, vast and sharp, hanging directly above our fragile bag of gas. It was bigger than any cathedral, bigger than the ironworks at Essen. It stretched out so far that it blotted out the constellations. I looked for the seams. On our ship, you could see every rivet, every stitch where the canvas met the duralumin frame. We were built by hands, piece by piece. This thing was not built. It was a single, smooth surface, darker than the night around it. It did not reflect the moonlight. It drank it. It was like a slab of polished obsidian or black ice, perfect and terrible. There were no propellers, no exhaust pipes belching smoke, no rudders to catch the air. It defied every rule of how things fly. A heavy pressure settled on my chest, a weight that had nothing to do with gravity. It felt as if the sky itself was bearing down on us, crushing the breath out of our lungs. We were men who knew the size of engines and the lift of hydrogen. But this thing had no engine. It sat there in silence, a mountain floating in the void. I felt small. I felt like an insect crawling on a window pane, waiting for a giant thumb to press down. The silence was no longer empty. It was waiting. In the shadow above us was the face of something that had never known the touch of a human hand. Then came the smell. It was not the stink of the latrine or the sweet rot of hydrogen anymore. It hit us like a slap in the face. It smelled the way the air does right after a lightning strike hits a tree close by, sharp and sour. It smelled like burning stone and sulfur, a scent that belonged deep underground, not high in the clouds. It stung the back of my throat and made my eyes water. It was the smell of a storm that had no rain, only fire. The air inside the gondola changed. It became heavy and prickly. The hair on my arms stood straight up, pushing against the wool of my sleeves. I felt a crawling sensation on my scalp, like 1,000 ants marching under my flight cap. I reached out to steady myself on the aluminum railing, but I pulled my hand back with a hiss. The metal was not just cold, it was dead freezing. It burned my palm instantly, stripping the skin as if I had touched a red-hot poker. The cold was radiating from the ship itself, as if the heat was being sucked out of the iron by the thing above us. I looked at the glass windows. Frost was forming, but it was not the jagged, fern-like frost of winter. These were perfect circles and spirals, growing fast, spinning outward like clockwork gears made of white ice. They covered the glass in seconds, shutting us in. I tried to swallow, but my mouth tasted like I had been chewing on a brass penny. It was a thick, metallic taste, the taste of blood and old copper. We all felt it. I saw Muller clutching his throat, his face turning red. The air had turned into syrup. Every breath we took was a fight, dragging a heavy, invisible fluid into our lungs that tasted of electricity and fear. We were drowning in the open air. The silence broke when Muller screamed. It was not a scream of pain, but of a man whose world had just shattered. He was staring at the navigation table. I looked over his shoulder and felt my stomach drop. The magnetic compass, the one thing a sailor or airman trusts more than his own mother, was possessed. The needle was not pointing north. It was spinning so fast it was a blur, whirring like a child's top. It clattered against the glass housing until the crystal cracked with a sharp snap, sending shards flying onto the map. I looked at my wristwatch. The second hand was not ticking. It was racing backward, sweeping counterclockwise at a speed that made me dizzy. I grabbed the wrist of the man next to me. His watch had stopped dead at the exact moment the engines died. Time itself was broken in that cabin. The airship was no longer in 1916. We were drifting in a place where hours and minutes had no meaning. From the radio corner, the operator tore the headset from his ears and threw it to the floor. I could hear the sound coming from the earpieces, even from where I stood. It was not the static of the atmosphere or the Morse code of the fleet. It was a rhythmic, grinding screech, like two massive stones rubbing together deep in a cave. It sounded like a language spoken by machines that hated us. Then the instrument panel exploded in a shower of sparks. There was no power. The batteries were dead, yet blue fire jumped from the dials, arcing through the air like angry snakes. The main cabin lights flickered and died, but we were not left in the dark. A new light bathed us, a sick, pale green glow that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It made our faces look like corpses. Men who had flown through flak and fire without flinching fell to their knees. I saw Schmidt clutching his rosary, his lips moving in silent prayer. He thought it was the devil. In that green light, with the compass screaming and time running backward, I believed him. We thought the metal skin of the gondola was a shield. We thought the layers of rubberized canvas and the aluminum skeleton would hide us from the thing above. We were wrong. A column of white radiance pierced the top of the airship as if the hull were made of mist. It did not tear the fabric or break the frame. It simply passed through them. I looked up through the glass observation port and saw the interior of our own ship lit up like a paper lantern. The massive gas cells, usually hidden in the dark, were glowing. I could see the gas moving inside them, swirling like smoke in a bottle. The beam came down through the ceiling of the control car. It did not stop at the roof. It slid through the metal plates as easily as sunlight passes through a window pane. It was a solid thing, a pillar of milk-white brightness that touched the floor and pooled there like spilled water. It moved. It swept back and forth, examining the controls, the maps, and the shivering men. It was searching. It moved with a fluid grace, pausing over the broken compass, then sliding over the captain's boots. It was not a warm light. When it brushed against my shoulder, I felt a chill that went deeper than the freezing air outside. It was a coldness that numbed the nerves. But the worst part was the clarity. Under that beam, everything was too sharp. I could see the pores on Muller's face, the scratches on the brass levers, the dust motes floating in the dead air. It revealed everything, stripping away the comfort of the shadows. We were naked before it. I tried to crawl backward, pressing my spine against the cold wall. I looked at the floor and saw something that made my blood turn to ice. The shadows were wrong. The beam was in the center of the room, so our shadows should have been cast against the walls, away from the light. But my shadow stretched toward the light. It reached out across the floorboards, trying to touch the white pillar as if my own darkness was being pulled into it. The laws of nature were unraveling. We huddled in the corners, covering our faces, praying that the eye of the storm would not look at us. But we knew it saw everything. Captain Strasser was the first to try to fight. He was a man of war, and when he was cornered, his instinct was to kill. I saw the intent in his face. His eyes locked onto the pillar of white light, and his right hand twitched toward the holster at his belt. He meant to draw his Luger and shoot the intruder, even if it was just a beam of light. I watched his fingers curl, fighting the air as if it were thick mud. He strained, the veins in his neck bulging, his face turning purple with effort. But his hand did not rise. It hung at his side, trembling, anchored by a weight that wasn't there. I tried to go to him. I shouted a command in my mind. Move your legs. Stand up. But my legs were not mine anymore. I was a prisoner in my own skin. My boots were glued to the floorboards. I tried to lift my arm to shield my eyes, but the signal from my brain simply vanished before it reached the muscle. It was not like being tied with ropes. It was worse. It was as if the connection between my will and my body had been cut with shears. I was a statue, a piece of furniture in the room, fully awake but utterly helpless. The silence in the cabin was broken by a sound that did not come from the air. It started deep inside my head, behind my eyes. It was a low, grinding hum, like a cello string bowed too hard, vibrating against the base of my skull. I tried to cover my ears, but my hands would not move, and it would not have mattered. The sound was in the bone. It drilled into my teeth and rattled my jaw. It was a sound that demanded submission. The only things we could move were our eyes. I rolled them frantically, in their sockets, looking at my shipmates. They were all frozen in twisted poses of fear. Muller was hunched over the map, his mouth open in a silent scream. The radio operator was slumped against the wall, one hand half raised. We stared at each other, sharing a terror that had no voice. I felt a wetness on my cheeks. Tears were streaming down my face, not because I was sad, but because I could not blink. My eyes burned, wide open to the unnatural light, weeping without my permission. We were like rabbits caught in a mesmerizing gaze, waiting for the predator to strike, knowing there was nowhere left to run. The door to the control car was bolted shut against the freezing wind. It did not open. There was no sound of the latch lifting, no sudden rush of cold air. But in the space of a single heartbeat, the cabin was no longer ours. 3 figures stood among us. They did not enter. They simply became. One moment the space was empty, and the next they were there, occupying the air where a man should not fit. They were not made of flesh that bleeds or bone that breaks. They looked like statues carved from heat haze or thick smoke. Their bodies shimmered, twisting the light around them so that you could not focus on their edges. They were tall, looming over us in the cramped space, their limbs long and thin like spider legs. They did not wear uniforms or coats. They were naked, but not in the way a man is naked. They were smooth, featureless, a pale gray that matched the fog outside. They did not walk. There was no sound of boots on the metal floorboards. They glided, hovering inches above the deck, moving with a drift that made my stomach turn. It was the movement of things that do not respect gravity. They passed between the frozen crewmen, drifting around us like oil on water. When one passed near me, the air turned freezing cold, and I smelled that sharp, burning scent of ozone again. Their heads were wrong. They were too large for their thin necks, swollen and bulbous. Where a face should be, there were no noses, no mouths, no ears. Just two large, dark patches where eyes might have been, staring at nothing and everything at once. They moved through the ship with a terrible calm, ignoring our terror. I saw Captain Strasser fighting his paralysis, the veins in his neck pulsing as he tried to scream a command to order them out. But his jaw was locked tight as iron. The intruders did not even look at him. To them, the captain of the Imperial Airship service was nothing more than furniture. One of the gray shapes drifted toward the rear of the cabin, toward Fritz. He was the youngest of us, a boy who had lied about his years to fly for the fatherland. He stood frozen by the ballast wheels, his eyes wide and wet with panic. The thing stopped in front of him. It raised a limb that was too long to be a human arm. The end of it did not have fingers, but thin, pale feelers that twitched in the cold air like the legs of a spider. It reached out and touched Fritz on the chest, right over his heart. There was no sound of a blow, but the smell of singed wool filled the air. Where the gray fingers touched his heavy leather jacket, a light bloomed. It glowed a dull, angry orange, like iron pulled fresh from a forge. Fritz could not scream. The paralysis held his jaw shut, but his eyes rolled back into his head until only the white was showing. He was awake, but his mind had retreated, fleeing into the dark to escape the touch of the monster. Then I saw the impossible. The creature pulled its hand back slowly, and a red drop, perfectly round and shining like a liquid ruby, floated through the air, following its fingers. It was blood. It had come through the skin, through the tunic, and through the leather without cutting a hole. It hung in the space between them, a suspended jewel of life. The entity tilted its large, swollen head, looking at the blood with a cold, dead curiosity. It did not want to eat him. It was studying him. It looked at the blood the way a scientist looks at a beetle pinned to a board. The other two shadows ignored the boy. They floated over the navigation table, their pale limbs passing right through the brass instruments and the maps. They did not touch the wheels or the gas valves. They looked at our machines, the best engineering in the world, with a sense of boredom. They were dismissive, as if our airship was nothing more than a toy made of sticks and mud. We were not soldiers to them. We were not even enemies. We were just samples in a jar, floating in the dark, waiting to be measured by things that did not know the meaning of mercy. The low vibration in our skulls did not stay low. It began to climb. It rose in pitch, higher and tighter, until it was no longer a sound, but a needle driven into the ear. It was a shriek, a single piercing note that felt like it was cracking my teeth. I wanted to scream to drown it out, but my throat was still frozen. The sound filled the gondola, drowning out the wind and the blood rushing in my head. It was the sound of a tea kettle screaming just before it bursts, but magnified 1,000 times. Then the world turned white. It was not the gentle light of the dawn or the yellow glow of a lamp. It was a blinding, absolute whiteness, brighter than a magnesium flare set off in a dark room. It erased the shadows. It erased the intruders. It erased the floor beneath my feet. I could not close my eyes. The lids would not obey me. The light went through them anyway, burning an image of pure, blank fire into my brain. There was no up or down anymore. There was only the light. I felt a sudden, sickening lurch. It was the feeling of a falling elevator, but wrong. I was not falling down toward the earth. I was falling up. Gravity seemed to reverse, pulling me toward the ceiling, toward the sky, toward the source of that terrible brilliance. My boots left the floorboards. I was floating, weightless and terrified, suspended in the milk-white void. Then my mind began to break. Time stopped flowing like a river and started to skip like a scratched record. I saw things that had already happened. I saw Muller breaking the compass again. Then I saw things that had not happened yet: fire, mud, and twisted metal. I saw my mother's face in the kitchen back in Hamburg, clear as day. Then I was back in the blinding light. The memories chopped and looped, a carousel spinning too fast. The white light shattered into colors I cannot name. Sparks of violet, deep, drowning blues, and angry reds. It was a kaleidoscope spinning behind my eyes. Then, with a snap like a breaking branch, the colors vanished. The sound cut out. The world was snatched away, and I fell into a deep, dreamless velvet black. There was no transition, no slow fading of the dream. The white blindness simply cut out, plunging us back into the suffocating dark of the night. The intruders were gone. The silence that had crushed us was shattered by a sound like a cannon shot. The port engine backfired, a violent explosion of fuel that shook the entire frame of the ship. Then the starboard motor caught, coughing and sputtering, spitting sparks and black smoke past the window. The roar returned, but it was not the steady rhythm of a machine in flight. It was the ragged, choking scream of a dying beast. Then the hand that held us let go. For minutes or hours, we had been pinned against the sky, held up by something other than gas and physics. Now, nature took us back. The Zeppelin dropped. It did not glide. It fell like a stone thrown down a well. My stomach slammed into my throat. The floorboards seemed to drop away from under my boots, and I was thrown hard against the brass railing. The ship groaned, a terrible screech of twisting metal and stretching canvas as the sudden weight tore at the frame. We were heavy again, and we were falling. The paralysis broke as violently as the ship fell. The invisible chains snapped. I saw Captain Strasser collapse to his knees, his hands clutching the wheel not to steer, but to keep from falling. He retched, violently sick, vomiting bile onto the deck plates. The vertigo was blinding. The world was spinning around us. Men were groaning, trying to stand up on legs that felt like jelly. We were weak, shaking as if we had the fever, our muscles burning from the tension of being frozen for so long. I scrambled toward the instrument panel, slipping on the slick floor. The dials were flickering with weak, yellow light again. I looked at the pressure gauges. The needles were in the red. The gas cells above us were leaking. I could hear the hiss of hydrogen escaping, a sound like 1,000 snakes in the ceiling. The ship was listing, tilting dangerously to the left. Strasser wiped his mouth and screamed for the elevators to be raised, but the wheel was heavy. The cables felt rusted, sluggish. We pulled together, fighting the weight of the air pressing down on us. I glanced at the altimeter. The needle was no longer frozen. It was unwinding, spinning counterclockwise so fast it was a blur. We were losing hundreds of feet with every breath. The cloud layer was rushing up to meet us, a floor of gray mist that we were about to smash through. The calm of the violet light was gone. Now there was only the wind, the screaming engines, and the terrifying certainty that the earth was coming for us. We had been touched by the stars, and now the ground was demanding its due. The ship was dying. We could feel it in our feet. The great metal skeleton above us was twisting, the duralumin ribs snapping with loud, gunshot cracks. We listed hard to the port side, the floor tilting until it was steep as a roof. Tools, loose maps, and unbolted chairs slid across the deck, piling up against the wall. We were not flying anymore. We were sliding out of the sky, a wounded whale dragging its belly through the air. The clouds parted one last time, and the British searchlights found us. They did not need to hunt for us now. We were a massive, falling target. The beams crossed over our hull, locking on, bathing us in a harsh, theatrical white light. But the guns below remained silent. Perhaps they saw we were already doomed. Perhaps they were too stunned to fire at the burning, smoking wreck tumbling toward them. We were exposed, pinned against the dark by the beams, falling in a spotlight for the whole city to see. "Ballast," Strasser croaked, his voice raw. "Drop the ballast." It was a desperate order, the last gasp of a captain trying to save his ship. We scrambled toward the release levers and the heavy sandbags. But our bodies were still broken from the paralysis. My arms felt like they were filled with water. I grabbed a toggle, but my fingers were numb and clumsy. I pulled, but I had no strength. Next to me, Muller was weeping, trying to shove a bag of sand out the hatch, but he collapsed, his legs giving way. We were too weak to save ourselves. The earth rushed up to meet us. I saw the Thames River below, a black ribbon of oil reflecting the moon and the searchlights. It looked cold and hard. Trees and fields flashed by in the dark, growing larger with every second. The altimeter was screaming, the needle spinning past the red line. There was no more time for orders. The chain of command had shattered along with the compass. We were just men now, huddled in a falling metal box. I grabbed the railing, wrapped my arms around the cold aluminum, and closed my eyes. I did not pray for a miracle. I prayed that the ground would kill me instantly. We hit the earth not like a bird landing, but like a falling cathedral. The first impact was the trees. I heard them snapping like dry twigs, a sound of splintering wood that tore through the metal skin of the ship. Then came the mud. The gondola slammed into the soft, wet ground of the marsh with a force that knocked the breath out of me. I was thrown across the cabin, slamming into the twisted remains of the navigation table. The world turned upside down. Above us, the great aluminum skeleton of the Zeppelin crumpled. It screamed as it folded in on itself, the girders bending and snapping like bones under a heavy boot. I curled into a ball, covering my head with my arms, waiting for the end. I waited for the heat. I waited for the hydrogen to catch a spark from the hot engines and turn the night into a furnace. I knew what happened when an airship crashed. It became a falling sun. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the fire that would peel the flesh from my bones. I held my breath, waiting to burn. But the fire did not come. There was no explosion. There was no wall of flame. Instead, there was only the sound of hissing. The engines, half buried in the muck, sizzled as the hot metal met the cold swamp water. Steam rose up around us, thick and white, smelling of oil and wet earth. I opened my eyes in the darkness. The ship was dead. The massive gas cells had collapsed, draping the wreckage in acres of gray canvas. But they had not ignited. It was a miracle that felt like a curse. We should have been ash. The silence that followed was heavy. The wind whistled through the torn fabric, flapping it against the broken frame. I tried to move, but my leg was pinned under a piece of piping. I tasted blood in my mouth. I listened for the voices of my crewmates, but I heard only the groans of the settling wreckage. Then, in the distance, I saw bobbing lights. Yellow beams from lanterns and torches were cutting through the dark. I heard shouting in English. The local police, the farmers, the people of the village. They were coming to see the monster that had fallen from the stars. I lay in the mud, half blinded by blood and oil, watching the lights of the village men bobbing toward us. They were shouting, their voices full of the anger and fear that comes with finding a monster in your backyard. But as they got closer, their shouting died down. They stopped at the edge of the crater we had made. They did not need their lanterns to see the beast. The skin of the Zeppelin was glowing. It was not the orange glare of a fire, but a low, rhythmic pulse, like a dying heartbeat trapped inside the aluminum. It was a faint, sick color, somewhere between the pale belly of a fish and the violet light of the stars. One of the constables, a big man in a dark coat, stepped forward to grab a piece of the twisted frame. He wanted to pull the canvas aside to get to the men inside. The moment his gloved hand touched the metal, he screamed. He jerked back, clutching his hand to his chest. The metal was not just hot, it was searing. It held a heat that had nothing to do with the engines. There was a fever in the iron itself. I could see the steam rising off his leather glove. The ship was cooking the mud around it, yet there were no flames. The grass around the wreck was covered in a strange dust. It looked like snow in the beam of their electric torches, but it did not melt. It was a fine silver ash, shimmering like ground glass. It covered everything, the broken trees, the water, and the hull. When the wind shifted, it blew the dust into my face. It tasted sour, like sucking on a galvanic battery. It coated my tongue with a metallic film that made me want to retch. Then they shone their lights into the crushed gondola. I saw the beam sweep over Mueller and the others. They were slumped over their stations, their bodies still strapped into the chairs. The crash had flattened the control car, twisted the floor, and snapped the girders. Yet the men looked whole. There was no blood on them. Their limbs were not bent at wrong angles. They looked as if they had simply fallen asleep at their posts. But men who die in a crash do not look like that. They looked like wax dolls left too close to a fire, soft and unblemished, sitting amidst the ruin of twisted steel. The silence of the dead was louder than the wind. I watched through the shattered glass as they pulled Mueller from his seat. The constable and a soldier gripped his shoulders, expecting dead weight. They expected broken bones, limbs twisted like the metal around us. But Mueller came out stiff. He was not limp like a fresh corpse. He was hard, locked in the shape of his last moment. They laid him on the wet grass, and the light from their lanterns fell on his face. He had no cuts. There was no blood on his tunic. In a crash that crumpled iron like paper, his skin was unbroken. But it was not the pale skin of a dead man. It was bright, angry red. He looked as if he had fallen asleep on a beach in the height of summer, burned by a noon sun. But we had been flying in the freezing dark. There was no sun in the sky, only the moon and that terrible violet star. The redness went down his neck and disappeared under his collar. It was a burn that seemed to glow in the dim light. And his eyes. God, his eyes. They were wide open, staring up at the mist. There was no blue left in them. The black part, the pupil, had opened so wide it had swallowed the color. They were just two black pits, windows into a room with no light. The soldier who held him recoiled, wiping his hands on his trousers, as if he had touched something unclean. I saw them pull the others out. Schmidt, the radio operator, the boy Fritz, all of them the same. Red skin, black eyes, bodies as stiff as statues. They looked like they had been frightened to death, frozen in the split second before the soul left the body. The men pulling them out were veterans. I heard them speak of the trenches, of Ypres and the Somme. They had seen men blown apart by shells and cut down by gas. But they looked at my crewmates with a different kind of fear. This was not the work of war. It was the work of something that did not belong in a grave. They did not take the bodies to a morgue. They did not want the village to see what was inside the uniforms. They pitched a heavy canvas tent right there in the marsh, lit by hissing gas lamps that cast long, shaking shadows against the walls. I was there, strapped to a stretcher, alive but unable to feel my legs. They thought I was unconscious, but I saw everything through the slit of my swollen eyes. The army surgeon, a man named Miller with gray whiskers and bloodshot eyes, stood over the table. He had a cigarette burning in his mouth to hide the smell. But nothing could hide what came next. He took his scalpel to Fritz's chest. He expected to see the pale layers of fat and the dark red of muscle. He expected blood to well up from the cut. But when the blade parted the skin, no red water flowed. What oozed out was black. It was thick and slow, like tar melted on a hot road or the treacle you put on porridge. It did not smell like iron and life. It smelled like vinegar and old batteries. Miller stopped, his hand shaking, the ash from his cigarette falling onto the rubber apron. He wiped the black sludge away and widened the cut. I heard him gasp. He called the other officer over, his voice trembling. Inside the boy's chest, there were no distinct organs. The heart, the lungs, the liver, they had lost their shape. They had turned into a thick, colored soup, like wax figures left too close to a furnace. The heat from the violet star had not just burned the skin, it had cooked them from the inside out. The redness went all the way through, turning the meat of the muscle into something soft and useless. Miller tried to use his forceps to pull back the rib cage to see more. He applied the slightest pressure to the bone. It did not bend, it did not saw. It crumbled. The white bone turned to dust and grit under his metal tool, snapping like a piece of dry chalk. The structure of the man was gone. Miller dropped the instrument and stepped back, wiping his forehead. He muttered that he had only seen tissue like this once before, in men who worked with the new X-ray machines for too long. But this was the damage of 100 years compressed into an hour. He looked at me, then back at the black slime on the table, and I saw the realization in his eyes. He knew that whatever had killed them had simply walked through their bodies without breaking the skin. An intelligence officer, a man with a stiff collar and a face like a hawk, found the captain's logbook in the mud. He tried to build a timeline of the night. He read the entries, noting the takeoff, the bombing run, and the turn toward the sea. But then he stopped. He looked at the last entry, then he looked at the crash site, and then he looked at his own pocket watch. He shook his head. There was a hole in the night. According to the ink on the paper, we had crashed 40 minutes before we actually hit the ground. For nearly an hour, the Zeppelin had existed nowhere. The mechanics checked the fuel tanks. They tapped the gauges and measured the remaining petrol. Their faces went pale. Based on the distance we had flown, the tanks should have been half full. They were empty, dry as a bone. The engines had run for hours longer than the flight path required. We had burned enough fuel to fly to Berlin and back, yet we had only crossed the channel. The machine said we had been flying for an eternity, but the clock said we had only been in the air for a short time. The math did not make sense. The world of numbers had broken down just like the bodies of my friends. They collected the personal effects of the dead. They made a pile of silver pocket watches and wristwatches on a canvas sheet. I heard the clink of metal on metal. One of the soldiers noticed it first. He held up 2 watches, side by side. Then he picked up a third. They had all stopped. That is not so strange in a crash. The impact breaks the springs. But they had not stopped at different times. Every single watch, from the captain's gold piece to the cheap steel dial of the cabin boy, was frozen at the exact same second. The hands were all pointing to the moment the white light took us. Time had died on that ship, long before we hit the earth. I was not the only one pulled from the wreck alive. 2 gunners from the tail section, men who sat far away from the control car, had survived the impact. But they were not men anymore. They sat in the mud, rocking back and forth, drooling on their tunics. They did not speak German. They did not speak English. They babbled in a tongue that sounded like wet stones clicking together. When the doctor shined a light in their eyes, they screamed. They screamed that they were not in the swamp. They screamed that they were still in the stars, floating in the great cold void, while the city of London burned 1,000,000 miles below them. They were broken, their minds left behind in that place where the violet star lives. The examination of the dead did not end with the scalpel. As they tried to lift Captain Strasser's body from the table to a coffin, his tunic fell open. There was something buried in his flesh, right in the center of his chest, where the bone should be. It was not a piece of shrapnel or a shard of the Zeppelin's frame. It was a shape. It was a perfect black cube, no larger than a die, embedded deep in the muscle as if it had grown there. It pushed the skin outward, tight and pale, until the skin split and revealed the object beneath. A young British private, a boy with mud on his face, reached out to pull it free. He thought it was debris. I tried to shout a warning, but my voice was a whisper. His fingers brushed against the black surface. He frowned. It was not cold like the night or the dead body. It was warm. It pulsed with a steady, living heat. It was not metal, for it had no grain, and it was not stone, for it was too smooth. It looked like a piece of the night sky that had solidified and fallen to earth. The moment he grasped it, the private dropped his hand, as if he had been bitten. He grabbed his own wrist, his face twisting in confusion. He said he could not feel his fingers. A cold numbness was shooting up his arm, past the elbow, reaching for his shoulder. It was the feeling of a limb that has fallen asleep, but painful and heavy. The object vibrated on the table, humming against the dead captain's ribs, making the tools on the tray rattle. The intelligence officer in the long coat did not hesitate. He did not ask what it was. He moved with a speed that frightened me. He barked an order, and a heavy lead box, the kind used for photographic plates, was brought forward. He used a pair of long iron tongs to seize the black cube. When the iron touched the object, a spark of blue light snapped in the air. He dropped it into the box and slammed the lid. But even through the thick lead, we could hear it. A low thrumming sound, like a hive of angry bees, came from inside the container. The private who had touched it was led away. He was rubbing his arm, looking pale. I saw him later, sitting by the wheel of a truck. He was vomiting. In the light of the headlamps, I saw him run a hand through his hair, and a clump came away in his fist. He looked at it, terrified. The sickness of the violet star had passed into him just from a touch. He was rotting while he sat there, poisoned by a thing that had no business existing in our world. By the time the sun tried to break through the morning fog, the men from the War Office had taken control. They arrived in a convoy of dark trucks, moving with a cold efficiency that scared me more than the crash. They did not care about the wounded or the dead. They cared only about the metal and the silence. They set up a perimeter of barbed wire and soldiers with bayonets fixed. They pushed the local police back, shouting orders that brokered no argument This was no longer a crash site. It was a vault, and they were locking the door. They took everything. Teams of men in rubber aprons loaded the twisted aluminum skeleton onto flatbed trucks. They shoveled the silver ash into sacks, scraping the mud clean until only brown earth remained. The bodies of my crewmates, the red, stiff dolls that used to be men, were thrown into lead-lined crates and nailed shut without a prayer. They treated them like hazardous waste, like unexploded bombs that might go off if handled too roughly. They wanted to erase the stain of the night from the field. Then they came for us. An officer with eyes like flint stood over my stretcher. He did not ask what I saw. He told me what I saw. He told me that a lucky shell from an anti-aircraft gun had struck our tail. He told me the engines had failed and we had crashed. There were no lights. There was no stopped time. There were no intruders. He leaned close, his breath smelling of stale tobacco, and whispered that if I spoke a word about the Violet Star, I would be shot for treason. It was not a threat. It was a promise. They were terrified. Not of the Germans, but of the panic that would spread if the world knew we were not alone in the sky. I saw a photographer from a London newspaper trying to snap a picture from the road. Two soldiers tackled him, smashing his camera into the dirt. They pulled the film out and exposed it to the light, destroying the evidence before it could ever be developed. They burned the notebooks of the constables in a metal drum. I watched the smoke rise, carrying the truth away into the gray sky. Dr. Miller tried to hand over his medical report, the one detailing the liquefied organs and the impossible burns. The intelligence man took the file, glanced at the pages, and then dropped it directly into the fire. Miller stood there, his mouth open, watching his science turn to ash. The official story was already being written in the telegraph offices. It was a story of a brave British gunner and a lucky shot. It was a lie that made sense. It was a lie that let people sleep at night. The truth was too heavy to carry, so they buried it deep in the archives, under a stamp that meant never to be opened. We were kept in a quarantined ward at the edge of the military hospital, far away from the men with shrapnel wounds and trench foot. They put armed guards at the door to keep us in and the world out. I watched the two tail gunners, the ones who had been babbling in the mud, wither away like dry leaves thrown into a fire. It did not take long. The sickness that had started up there in the freezing sky was eating them from the inside, and there was no medicine on earth that could stop it. First, it was their mouths. Their gums turned black and soft, bleeding onto their pillows in the night. Their teeth loosened and fell out, clicking into their tin cups when they tried to drink water. Then came the sores. Angry red patches opened on their skin, not like cuts or burns, but like the flesh was dissolving into liquid. They smelled of copper and spoiled meat. The doctors wore thick masks, but not to protect the patients. They wanted to hide from the smell of men who were rotting while they were still breathing. The madness was worse than the physical rot. They did not sleep. They lay there with their eyes pinned open, staring at the dark corners of the room. They screamed about cold fire and the eyes that do not blink. They were not seeing the hospital walls. They were back in the void, paralyzed under the violet light. When the nurses tried to wash them, I saw sparks snap from their skin. Blue static jumped from their flesh to the nurses' hands, stinging them. The staff stopped touching them with bare hands after that. They used thick rubber gloves, treating the dying men like lepers. They died within the month. It was not a peaceful end. They fought the air, choking on their own black blood, terrified of the shadows. The orderlies did not put them in simple pine boxes. They brought in heavy coffins lined with sheets of lead, the kind used to transport volatile chemicals. There were no priests, no flags, and no salutes. They were taken out the back door in the dead of night and buried in a field, with no stones to mark their heads. I saw the medical charts before they were taken away. The cause of death was stamped in red ink. Chemical exposure. It was a clean lie to cover a dirty truth. The war had not killed them. The thing in the sky had taken them, piece by piece. The Great War ended. The guns finally fell silent, and the world tried to wash the blood from its hands. But the marsh at Little Wigborough did not forget. For years afterward, the villagers would stand on their porches at night, watching the estuary. They did not look for German raiders anymore. They looked for the pale, violet lights that sometimes danced over the mudflats. They told their children it was swamp gas or the spirits of the dead, but they locked their doors all the same. They knew that the darkness out there was different. The land itself bore the mark of our fall. The farmers cursed the fields near the crash site. Their ewes gave birth to lambs with 2 heads or legs twisted like tree roots. The milk from their cows turned sour in the pail, smelling of that same metallic ash. And where the crushed gondola had rested, the grass never grew back. It remained a patch of black, barren earth, a scar that refused to heal. Even the birds would not land there. It was a dead spot in the living world. Time did its work, as it always does. The story of the ship that fell from the stars became a story of a ship that was shot down by a hero. Then it became a rumor. Then it became a ghost story told in the local pub. They called it the Ghost Zeppelin, a myth to scare travelers. The men who knew the truth, the soldiers, the doctors, the men in the long coats. They took the secret to their graves. The files are rotting in a basement in London, sealed with wax and fear. I am an old man now. My breath is short, and my hands shake, but not from age. I am the last one left who remembers the cold of that void. Sometimes, when the night is very quiet, I can still hear the hum. It is faint, like a wire vibrating in the wind, but it is there. I look up at the stars, and I do not see heaven. I see a deep, endless ocean where things that are not human swim in the silence. The world believes we are safe, that we are the masters of the earth. But I know the truth. We are just small things hiding in the grass, and something vast is watching us from the dark. The mud of 1916 covers the wreckage, but it cannot cover the memory. We were touched by the unknown, and I fear that one day it will come back to finish what it started.